This Parsha podcast is dedicated in loving memory of Martha Bigley, a dear friend of Torch, a longtime student of Torch who passed away this week. May her soul be elevated in heaven. We have some very exciting podcast updates as we near the end of the year. It was time a long time ago, but with the help of the Almighty and some very talented wall-bees, there is a new logo for one of my shows. The show is called This Jewish Life. It's the flagship podcast show. And it had a terrible logo, the podcast artwork that you see on your phone when it plays. It was awful. I made it myself. And you will be surprised to learn that graphic design is not part of the absolutely comprehensive rabbinic education that I received. And I was a little embarrassed of the logo. So I asked my wife to kindly make a new logo, and she did, and it's amazing. And to celebrate, I recorded two new podcasts, two Hanukkah podcasts for that show. Again, the show is called This Jewish Life. This one is the Parsha podcast. The Parsha podcast is a podcast, but it's also recorded on video, on Zoom, live, Tuesday evenings at 8 p.m. Central. But this is a different show called This Jewish Life. And on Sunday, we released an episode called The Light of Hanukkah. And this upcoming Sunday, there's a new episode that I recorded with my brother-in-law, Rabbi Botnick, always a delight, called Hanukkah Capstone. And now with the new logo. I'm so excited to record new shows because I'm no longer embarrassed of the podcast artwork. And once my wife finished with that logo, she said, okay, well, let's make some of the other logos. Let's update them. But I'm holding off on switching the Parsha podcast logo because even though I made it myself and it's very basic, and when I made it, it was just like a stand-in until eventually we got around to making a richer, more dynamic logo. But in 2018, so this is a while back already, I got an email from a listener of the podcast. And this is a quote. I looked it up today. I found the old email. She wrote, I found your podcast. She's talking about the Parsha podcast. About 6 months ago when I was looking for a Parsha podcast. I searched the word Parsha on Apple Podcasts. And to be honest, I chose yours because I liked the branding. She liked the logo. The simple off-white background with the title and your name was much easier on the eye than some of the other ones I came across. It made your podcast look up to date. Someone in 2018 told me that this was the podcast that she selected because of the logo. I can't change it. It's neat. It's sleek. It's up to date. And then there was a follow-up from this young woman. She wrote to me a few months later. This is a quote from the email. I wanted to send you a quick note as your podcasts have been pivotal in my journey towards embracing my Yiddishkeit. I arrived in Israel a few months ago to learn at Midreshet Rachel Vechaya for the winter. So this is a proven logo. It's very hard for me to change it. What do you think? Should we change it? Should we stick with the sleek, modern, up-to-date one that is inspiring people to download it? What do you think? Send me an email, rabbi@wallbejim.com. And one more quick note. As you perhaps know, we were recording episodes on a show called The Ethics Podcast, which goes through the book of ethics, the book of Pirkei Avos, of chapters of the fathers. It took us 7 years, but with the help of the Almighty, we finished it a few months ago. But I want to re-release it in 2025. And the idea is to reboot the show and to release them on a 3 times a week schedule, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And there's about 160 episodes in the whole show. And I thought maybe we could release it on that schedule. And if someone wants to join this initiative to maybe finish the book of ethics in a year, and we'll start in January 1st. It's a Wednesday. We'll start with the first episode. There's no better New Year's resolution than to have more Torah and to study the book of ethics of Pirkei Avos together with your friends in the Torch Center in Houston, Texas. Now, the first episode was recorded in 2017. So I said 2017, that's pretty old. That's a long time ago. It probably sounds really gnarly. So I actually listened to the first show. I remembered some of the ideas that I had said, even though it was a while back. But I thought it was pretty good. So this is good enough. This is up to our standard. So I'm going to re-release this, please God, on the Ethics Podcast channel 3 times a week for the whole year, please God. If someone wants to join that initiative, January 1st is a Wednesday. It's the first episode. And please God, we'll all become better people with enhanced intelligence and morals and depth of understanding and righteousness, become more refined people, become better friends, better parents, better spouses, and better Jews in 2025. And the best way to do that is with the Book of Ethics and with your pals, with your friend Yaakov Walby from the Torch Center in Texas, and the Ethics Podcast. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. It will not be released on the companion feed, the All Rabbi Yaakov Walby podcast. It's just going to be exclusively on the Ethics Podcast. Give it a listen. It's Parsha Mikeitz, and we're in the middle installment of the Joseph trilogy. In Parshas Vayeshev, Joseph, he dreamed. He was hated by his brothers. He was betrayed by his brothers. He was sold by his brothers. He was accused by Mrs. Potiphar of a crime he did not commit. He was imprisoned. He interpreted the dreams of his cellmates, and he was forgotten. Parshas Mikeitz. It begins 2 years after the events at the end of last week's Parsha. Joseph has been languishing in prison for 2 more years. And Pharaoh, the king, has a set of disturbing dreams. 7 big, fat, robust cows are consumed by 7 skinny ones. 7 robust stalks are swallowed by 7 withered stalks. And none of his gurus are able to interpret the dream satisfactorily. And Pharaoh is agitated. And the butler, Joseph's old cellmate, his memory is jogged. And he tells Pharaoh, when I was in the clink, there was this kid, there was this Hebrew youth, and he interpreted my dream, and he interpreted the baker's dream. Maybe he can help you. And we read a very dramatic verse, 41:14, Vayishlach Paro, and Pharaoh sent, and he called Joseph, and they rushed him out of the dungeon, and they gave him a haircut, and they switched his garments, and they brought him to Pharaoh. It took 1 verse to take Joseph and pull him out of prison and bring him before Pharaoh, all groomed and well coiffed. He's standing in the palace. You've seen the social media videos. They take an unkempt, homeless-looking guy, and they give him a wicked haircut, and suddenly he looks all hip and handsome and employable. Joseph has been in jail for a decade without a proper shower or shave. And in 1 verse, he's standing before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh tells him, Joseph, I had a dream and there's no interpreter, and I heard that you are a talented, gifted dream interpreter. And how does Joseph respond to this? What's the first words that he utters in a decade outside of prison? Vayan Yosef. Yosef responded to Pharaoh, Biladai. It's not true. The wisdom is not mine. It's not me. It's not I. Rather, God. He will use me as an instrument to bring peace to Pharaoh. This is an amazing idea that we see over here of the presence of mind of Joseph. He woke up that morning in jail, the same routine as it has been for a decade. And he's standing before Pharaoh, and he could taste freedom. And his mind is racing because he did not forget those dreams. And Pharaoh says, I hear that you're a talented dream interpreter. And Joseph says, no, you heard wrong. It's not me. Biladai, it's not me. God will help you. Maybe I could be an implement, an instrument of God. And my grandfather, blessed memory, used to say that the Midrash says that there were 3 people who were believers who were tested. They were tested suddenly and they failed. And he gives a list: Cain, Bilam, Chizkiah. They were all confronted with a test to see, is their faith, is it real? Is it top of mind? Or is it something that they have to conjure, so to speak, from their innards? Cain, God came to him and says, well, where's your brother? Famous question. And what's the proper response to that question when it comes from God? He should have said, Master of the world, you don't need my help. You know where everyone is. You know where everything is. Why are you asking me that question? But Cain, he failed. And he said, well, am I my brother's keeper? Hashomer achi anochi. That was the test that he failed. Had Cain had more time, he would have recognized what the appropriate response was. He was confronted, and it was sudden, and he failed. Joseph is confronted, and it's sudden, and he succeeds. And the first words that he says is, it's not me. You got the wrong guy. Pharaoh relates his dream, and if you read the dreams very carefully, and you compare the actual dreams with Pharaoh's retelling of the dreams, they're slightly different. And the Midrash tells us that this was part of Pharaoh's test of Joseph. He slightly altered the details of the dream. And Joseph was prophetically informed what the actual dreams were, and he corrected Pharaoh. And he interprets the dreams, the 2 dreams, they're really one. God is revealing his plans to you. There will be 7 years of unprecedented plenty, followed by 7 years of bruising famine, and you are advised to stockpile during the 7 years of plenty to prepare for the apocalypse set to arrive afterwards. And Pharaoh is duly impressed, and his servants are wowed, and he hands over the keys of the kingdom to Joseph. He gives him his ring. He bedecks him in the clothes of royalty. He renames him Tzafnas Paneach. He gives him Asnas, the daughter of Potiphar, as a wife. And Joseph is paraded throughout the city in the royal cavalcade. Joseph, the former slave, is now viceroy of Egypt, and his own dreams, it's starting to take shape. And Joseph begins the massive stockpiling effort. He's amassing grain as the sand of the sea. The verse tells us, 41:49. He starts to amass and stockpile grain as much as the sand of the sea until the point where there was no number. So Rashi says that means that they lost count. Like you can't possibly keep track of the enormous volumes of grain that Joseph stockpiled. I saw one of the other commentaries. He says something interesting. He says that there was so much grain that Joseph had organized that they reached a point where there was no number for it. You think there's 1,000. And if you have 1,000 thousands, well, then you have 1,000,000. And 1,000 millions, then you have 1,000,000,000. And 1,000 billions, well, then you have a trillion. But what's 1,000 trillion? I don't know. What comes next? I know that a Google is a 1 with 100 zeros, but is it a sextillion? Is it a septillion? I don't know. There's a point where you don't have a proper number for it. You've heard like the 10 to the 23rd. That's not really a number. That's not a proper number. Well, Joseph amassed grain, and he reached the point where there was just no more numbers. After 7 years of plenty and 7 years of assiduous preparation, the years of famine begin. And in all the lands, there's famine, there's hunger, and in the land of Egypt, there is bread. And the very next verse, this is verse 55, tells us that even in the land of Egypt there was hunger. And the nation called out to Pharaoh. They wanted bread. And he says, well, go ask Joseph. Whatever he tells you to do, do. So Rashi tells us that Joseph was not the only one who had stockpiled in Egypt. Everyone else also stockpiled, but theirs all spoiled. So only Joseph was the bearer of food. And they came to Joseph, hat in hand, and he said, you have to circumcise. That's the price of bread. And they came to Pharaoh, and they didn't want to do that. And Pharaoh says, listen, you knew that there was going to be a famine. Why didn't you stockpile? And they said, well, we did, but it spoiled. Oh, so only Joseph knows how to do this? You got to listen to Joseph. And they all circumcised. This was Joseph's precondition for food. Cash for clunkers. Bread for circumcision. Joseph's brothers circumcised the men of Shechem, at least for some time. And Joseph circumcised the men of Egypt, which, by the way, this is a precursor to the mixed multitude. The reason why there were some Egyptians who were inspired to join the Jewish people on the Exodus, it starts here. There were groups of Egyptians that were taken, that were moved, that were inspired by Joseph, and they became like a separate class, a separate group, a separate religion amongst the Egyptians, and they joined the nation with the Exodus. And then in chapter 42, his brothers arrive. Jacob sees that there is plenty, that there is food, that there is grain in Egypt. And he tells his sons, Lama tisra'u. Why do you make yourself appear as if you are satiated? And there's a fascinating commentary in Rashi. He explains what's Jacob telling his sons. Why are you presenting yourself in front of the Ishmaelites and the sons of Esav like you are satiated? Because at that time, when everyone is flocking to Egypt to get food, Jacob still had grain. So he didn't send his sons to go to Egypt to get grain. He had grain. He sent his sons to Egypt because he didn't want to show off. He didn't want to flaunt his grain in front of Esav and Ishmael. So he said, let's pretend that we also need food and join the throngs descending to Egypt. Jacob sends his 10 sons, everyone except Benjamin, to get food, and then the games begin. They meet Joseph. They don't recognize him. He accuses them of being spies. He imprisons them for 3 days. He demands that they bring Benjamin down. He gives them food and says, okay, but there's no more food until you bring me Benjamin. And he takes Shimon as a hostage until you bring Benjamin. And then he plays mind games with them. He tells his people, put food in their satchels, put their money there also. The brothers go back home. They discover the money there. They're terrified. They tell Jacob that the man wants to see Benjamin, and Jacob categorically refuses to send Benjamin. And Reuben pledges to guard him with his life, and Judah takes responsibility. Eventually, the famine is so bad, Jacob relents and he sends Benjamin, and they come to Joseph, and Joseph treats them all nicely, and they dine together. And then he frames Benjamin. Take my special goblet, the one that I divine with, so to speak, and place it in the satchel of Benjamin and send them away. Everyone, right? It's 11 brothers. They got Shimon back. But then chase him down and accuse him and arrest him. We're taking Benjamin. He is the criminal. And everyone heads back to Egypt, absolutely dejected. What's going to be? Jacob lost Joseph. He's going to lose Benjamin. And that's where the Parsha ends. And we only get the resolution in next week's Parsha. I want to start off by talking about a subject That's like a Parsha podcast, third rail subject. It's one that I basically never talk about. But every once in a while, we like to fly a bit too close to the sun, do something a bit risky. It's the end of 2024. It's going to have maybe a smaller audience than most Parsha podcasts. We could risk it. Most people are on vacation. We could slip in something here a bit controversial. I want to share an idea and use that idea as a springboard for a larger question and a larger subject that I refrain from talking about. The idea, it's one that I thought of a few years ago, and it brought me lots of joy then, and it still brings me lots of joy today. This is a really joyous idea. And we'll use that to explore the larger topic. Jacob sends his sons to go to Egypt to get food. And the verse says that he says, well, why are we showing off? Why are we presenting ourselves as if we're so satiated? Why are we showing off to the Ishmaelites, the sons of Esav, at that time when everyone else is going down to Egypt? They still had grain. And the question is very puzzling. Why does Jacob still have grain? Why does he have more food than everyone else? Do they chew slowly? Do they not eat as much? Do they typically stockpile more food? Was Jacob a prepper? Was he a survivalist? Did he know that there was a pending famine? I heard that the Mormons, there's some sort of law or custom where they have a year's worth of food they keep in stockpile just in case for when society breaks down. And there's lots of literature and lots of movies I've been told about this. Major cities only have about a few days worth of food. If the grid goes down, God forbid, there's an EMP attack, a nuclear attack, society breaks down, and there's no food. Was Jacob worried about that? Did he just always have a backup plan? Did he buy the food insurance at Costco? You could buy a year's worth of food at Costco. I don't think it's kosher, though. Why does Jacob have food when no one else has food? Now, the question is compounded by a teaching in the Talmud. The Talmud says that when the temple was destroyed, there was a deprecation in the level of faith of the nation. There was a spiritual decline that came together with the destruction of the temple. And from the time the temple was destroyed, there's no longer men of true faith. Real faith, that went extinct. Well, what's the definition of someone who has faith? So the Talmud tells us, if they have food today, they have bread in their basket today, but they have nothing for tomorrow. A man of true faith won't worry, won't even ask, what am I going to eat tomorrow? I have food today. What am I worried about tomorrow? The Almighty will take care of tomorrow's food. The mark of a person of complete and true faith is that they don't stockpile. They don't worry about what's going to be tomorrow. So how is it that Jacob seems to have more food than everyone else? Question number one. Question number two. Why is he worried specifically about Ishmael and Esav? And this question is actually asked by the Ramban. He says, Rashi says that Jacob was worried about the Ishmaelites and the sons of Esav. What about the Canaanites? In the books, the stand. 1 second later. People make these tribes, and you try to find your friends who have the stockpiles of food and the ammunition. Got to have lots of diesel, lots of food, tens of thousands of rounds, someone told me. Got to guard the perimeter. Why is no one worried about the locals? Why isn't he worried about the neighbors, the Canaanites? So the Ramban suggests that, well, the Ishmaelites weren't even in the land of Canaan at the time, but they were traveling to Egypt and they would stop by. They would travel and stop by and go visit their cousins, the sons of Jacob. And if it appears that everyone's well fed, there's lots of food to go around, well, then they'll say, hey, it's family. Let's swing by just to check up on our cousins, see how they're doing. And they'll want to eat together with sons of Jacob, and therefore he says it's better to just go down to Egypt. That's how the Ramban explains this idea in Rashi. But here's what I want to suggest. I want to suggest that Jacob did not have more food than the typical Canaanite, or for that matter, the typical Ishmaelite, the typical Esavite. But he did have more faith. If the Talmud tells us that the mark of a man of true faith is that when they have food today, but not for tomorrow, then they rely on God and they're not worried about tomorrow. That tells us that when does a person of true faith, when do they start to worry, to fret, to be concerned about the empty cupboard, the empty pantry, the empty grain silo? They start to worry when there's nothing left. If you have food for today but nothing for tomorrow, there's no reason to worry. So Jacob had the same amount of food as everyone else. But everyone else, it's a famine. There's no yield. There's no crops. And you know that you're losing, 2 inches of your silo every week or whatever it is. So you can do some math and realize that you'll be literally starving in 2 weeks. You better make a plan. How does everyone else address their dwindling stockpiles? They get frantic. They freak out. We're all going to die. We're doomed. We'll starve to death. But Jacob, until there's nothing left, what's there to worry about? So he's calm. And as a result of his total faith and reliance on God, he finds no reason to go to Egypt. Rashi does not actually say that they had more food or more grain than anyone else. Rashi says, at that time, they still had grain. Meaning, Jacob is not going to take action to address the looming crisis until the crisis actually hits, until there's no grain left. Not because he has more grain than everyone else, but because he has more faith. So everyone's making a beeline to Egypt. Everyone's anticipating, planning ahead, and he's at peace. He is at ease. And again, the mark of the believer, if you have bread in your basket today, but not for tomorrow, they don't even say, they don't even worry. They never even are concerned with the fact that they may not have food for tomorrow. Where were Ishmael and Esav on this question? They're not like Jacob. They didn't wait to the last second to replenish their food. Once they sense that there's a pending shortage, they scrambled for food like everyone else. So I want to suggest that what Jacob is telling his sons, don't show off to the Ishmaelites and the Esavites. It's not showing off that you have more food. You don't have more food than they do. This is a restriction against or a concern against spiritually showing off. The Canaanites, they look at Jacob, who has no food or 2 weeks worth of food, and they're calm. They look at him like he's a lunatic. They have no concept of the idea of faith and reliance on God. But Esav and Ishmael and their descendants, they have some semblance of a connection to true faith. They come from Abraham after all. So for them, they see Jacob and his family, they're not moving, they're not joining the masses going down to Egypt. They're going to experience some envy, not physical envy, but spiritual envy. And that's what Jacob is telling his sons. Don't show off spiritually to Esav and his sons and his families, and to Ishmael and his families. Jacob was a paragon of faith, of reliance on God. We call this emunah, faith, bitachon, reliance on God. And the Talmud tells us that the mark of a believer is calmness in the face of a pending hunger. There was a pending hunger, and everyone else was scrambling to rush to Egypt. But Jacob still had grain, so he didn't worry about it. But staying in Canaan would amount to flaunting his spiritual greatness, his faith, his righteousness, his reliance on God. And to do that to Esav and Ishmael, that's inappropriate. So he tells his sons, go down to Egypt with everyone else. So the first idea, of course, is the idea of faith and reliance on God. Jacob is a paragon of reliance on God. And the second idea, it's a much more sensitive and subtle idea, not to show off, not to flaunt spiritual greatness. If someone is spiritually great, that's wonderful. And that's for them to know and to enjoy and to revel in. But if others are liable to find out about it, Jacob teaches us that it's actually better to downplay your spiritual greatness and to pretend to have less faith and to join the throngs going to Egypt. But this is the third rail subject that I've really refrained from talking about. The idea of bitachon, reliance on God. I've had the great privilege, with the help of the Mikeitz, to record more than 1,000 podcast episodes. And I've very, very, very infrequently addressed this massive subject in Jewish life, the idea of bitachon, reliance on God. And there's two reasons why I've refrained from talking about it. Number one, because I think it's universally misunderstood. If you feel like you have reliance on God, by definition, you don't have reliance on God. Because reliance on God is something that you don't even feel. It's not like some sort of concerted boost of faith. I'm terrified. I feel dread. I feel danger. I'm worried. But I'm going to induce some reliance on God, notwithstanding that dread. That is not reliance on God. Reliance on God is when the faith is so real and so tangible and so palpable that of course God will give you food tomorrow. It's not surprising. It's not unexpected. It's a matter of course. Reliance on God, the definition of bitachon, is when your faith in God is so real. You know that He'll give you food tomorrow. You have no plans. There's no food in the whole country, but you know that He'll give you what you need. And you treat that the same way we treat the faucet when you walk over and you pick up the lever and water comes out of the spout. It's not like a parlor trick. It's not like a magic trick. It's not like a surprise. You've done it 1 billion times. And every time water comes out, unless there's something wrong, right? And it's not like, wow, I have faith. I truly believe that the water's going to come out. I'm going to do it. I'm going to lift it. I lift the lever. Wow, look at that. The water comes out. No, you just expect the water to come out. You lift the lever and it comes out. There's no, will it? Won't it? But I believe. None of that. It's obvious. It's a matter of course. And that's something which is very hard to actually arrive at. There's much loftier level than to say, my life is in shambles. I'm in a crisis. I have danger from all sides, but I'm believing in God. if there's any sense of dread, of fear, by definition, there's no reliance on God. So I think the subject is misunderstood. It's much loftier than what people suppose. It means that there's no worry. How could there be worry? No matter what. Jacob, if he had no food for tomorrow, he wouldn't be worried at all. That is a very lofty level. Now, a second reason why I don't like to speak about this is because, well, it's like an adjacent reason. The Talmud tells us that when the temple was destroyed, this level of faith went extinct. There are no longer any people like this anymore. So it's a level that's it's like talking about prophecy. Should we have a class? Prophecy 101, what to do? There's a book. I've told you about this book. Mesil Sisharim. You can read the book for how to revive the dead. Instructions, step by step by step. But how many of anyone that we know has actually achieved that level? Well, it's kind of extinct. There is no more prophecy. This level, the Talmud tells us, is extinct. It no longer exists. Today, if there's no food tomorrow, I have to worry. And if I pretend that I'm calm, well, I'm kind of misappropriating. I'm claiming to have greatness that I don't actually have. Today we have to worry about the lack of food for tomorrow because we're no longer in an era where there was that level of faith, that level of reliance on God. So this is my controversial opinion. I don't like the subject of reliance on God because it's not really our subject. Everyone has to have some controversial opinions. Our friend Dan Coleman, in his Shema podcast, he interviewed me last week. I said, I'm opposed to humility. I like to say these things that they're a little aggressive. And it sounds wrong. But then I explain, I'm opposed to humility. I actually am. I'm opposed to humility. Why? Because it's too close to mediocrity. People say, I'm humble, I'll stay small. No. Become as big as you can. Become outrageously great. And then the very capstone, the crown jewel of your spiritual edifice, that will be humility. But if you start with that, you'll end up with nothing. Anyhow, that's the second controversial opinion. I'm against humility. But the subject, I hear people talking about it all the time. And I'm wondering, tell me where I'm going wrong. Send me an email, rabbi@wallbajim.com, where I went wrong in my calculation. This is a subject that's lofty, too lofty for us. But I want to kind of talk more about Jacob's relationship with bitachon. Because I saw some sources, and I've been kind of assembling my sources here, and I'm going to share it with you. I think it's maybe even a little bit different than what people assume. Rashi, somewhere in the book of Genesis, says the following sentence, or words of a sentence. Batach Yaakov b'HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which means Jacob had faith, had reliance, had bitachon in God. Now, if you read that, if that's the only part of the sentence that I informed you about, you would say, well, Jacob had reliance on God. But the context, to me, is fascinating. And of course, this is maybe obvious, maybe it isn't. There's tension with reliance on God. Because reliance on God means to not have reliance on oneself. If I'm doing something, well, maybe I'm not relying on God. There's a bit of tension between taking initiative, doing something yourself, versus allowing God to take care of whatever needs to be taken care of. Here's where Rashi says this. This is in chapter 30, verse 25. Jacob is with Laban. And the reason why he's with Laban, of course, it's to have a family, but his brother wants to kill him. So you go back, it's suicidal. And the verse tells us that when Joseph was born, Jacob wanted to go back. What's the connection between the birth of Joseph and Jacob's desire to return home? So Rashi says that Joseph is the foil that thwarts Esav. Jacob, he's like a fire, and Esav is like a big pile of hay, but Joseph is the flame. And if you have a fire without a flame, it won't consume and combust the hay. So once Jacob has Joseph with him, now he has all the ingredients to defeat Esav, and he wants to go home. But Rashi says this whole piece, and he says, Jacob had Joseph, and now he has the flame, and he has the fire, and once Joseph is born, then Jacob relies on God and wants to go home. The word here is bitachon, reliance on God. But when does Jacob rely on God? Not before Joseph is born? Does he not have reliance on God before Joseph is born? He does. But it would be inappropriate to do something suicidal, Jacob is telling us, until you have what it takes to win. And to me, this is a novel description of reliance on God. It doesn't mean to go into a lion's den saying God will protect me. It means to have whatever it takes to survive and thrive and overcome the lion, and then to rely on God. Now, when I said this, Parsha Vayetze, by my Shabbos table, one of the people said, no, it can't be. The Rashi actually says that. I said, well, I'll show you here. Here it says it, chapter 30, verse 25. Again, this is part of my theory that this is a misunderstood subject. I also saw the Ramban. The Ramban, in his introduction to Parshas Vayishlach, when Jacob, now with Joseph in tow, he's going to meet Esav, and he prepares for war, and he splits the camp, and he prays, and he sends a gift. The Ramban says that this is coming to tell us not to rely on your righteousness, to instead do whatever you take, whatever you can do to survive. Whatever it takes to survive, whatever you can do to survive, do it. So both of these sources seem to say that Jacob maybe had not the standard typical view of bitachon that we are led to believe in many different times I hear this subject being discussed. But here's the other idea that I wanted to throw your way. This is, again, it's a discussion to me. I'm trying to figure out where we're landing on this subject. This past week's Parsha ended with Joseph in prison and the butler forgetting about Joseph and his plight. And the Parsha ends, the butler forgot him, didn't remember him. And Rashi explains why Joseph deserved to be forgotten. Because he relied on the butler, and he asked and requested the butler to remember him, to invoke him before Pharaoh. That's why Joseph was punished with 2 more years of imprisonment. And Rashi cites a verse, praiseworthy is he who relies on God and does not turn to the Rehavim. So what's the Rehavim? Rashi says that's a nickname for the Egyptians. Joseph was not sufficiently reliant upon God, and he turned to the Egyptians, and that's why he was punished with 2 more years of imprisonment. Now, this implies that Joseph made a mistake by asking the butler to lobby Pharaoh on his behalf. A couple of years ago, in Parshas Mikeitz, in a podcast titled Joseph's Crime, we offered 6 different explanations as to exactly where Joseph was flawed in his behavior. But here's where it gets interesting. How long were Jacob and Joseph separated for? Well, the verse tells us Joseph was 17 when he was sold, and he was 30 when he was appointed by Pharaoh, so that's 13 years. But then there was the 7 years of plenty, so 37, for a total of 20 years. And then the 2 years of the famine. And Jacob and Joseph reunite when Joseph is 39, 22 years after Joseph is sold. So Jacob and his favorite son Joseph, are separated for 22 years. Now Rashi, twice in the book of Genesis, in 28:9 and 37:33, Rashi does a calculation to explain that actually Jacob was separate from his father also for 22 years. Jacob, he left. He went to Laban. And he came back 22 years later. And Rashi says it's not a coincidence. Jacob, you left your father. You abandoned your father. You didn't fulfill honoring your father for 22 years. You're going to be punished by having your son, your favorite son, separated from you for 22 years as well. So the 22 years that Jacob did not fulfill the mitzvah of honoring his father, that is the same, or that's tit for tat for the 22 years that he was separated from Joseph. But it's actually more specific than that. Jacob only spent 20 years with Laban. He was there for 14 years working for his 2 daughters, and then 6 years he was working for pay. So that's only 20 years. Where's the extra 2 years? So if you read the description of the Torah, from when Jacob parted from Laban until he actually arrived at Isaac, it was 2 years. There were 2 years that were added on. Jacob took a very long, circuitous path. It was an odyssey until he arrived back home in the home of Isaac. He spent 18 months in a place called Sukkos and 6 months in a place called Beit El. It's an amazing thing. God tells Jacob in Parsha Vayetze, go back home. And he leaves. He absconds from Laban. And of course, Laban chases him down, and they have the showdown, the standoff. And he meets the angel of Esav, and then Esav, and finally he departs from Esav. We'll meet again. This is in chapter 33, verse 16. And now, apparently, the coast is clear. It's time to go home. But how long does it take for Jacob to actually arrive home to Isaac? 33:16, he departs from Esav. They meet in 35:27. I did the math. 4 verses in chapter 33, 31 verses in chapter 34, and 26 verses in chapter 35. 61 verses. And 2 full years after he leaves Esav, he arrives at the home of his father. And he does all sorts of things. He travels to Sukkos. He builds a house. He makes stalls for his sheep. He spends 18 months there. Then he goes elsewhere. He buys land in the burbs of Shechem. And he erects an altar and doesn't mention any sacrifices, but he has an altar. And there's the Dinah abduction fiasco and Shimon Levi massacring the whole city. And he goes to Beit El and builds a second altar. And Devorah dies and he's renamed Israel. And he heads towards Ephrat, and Rachel dies, and Benjamin is born. And he's slowly edging closer and closer to Isaac, but they don't reunite for a very long time. We have the episode of Reuven and Bilhah, the jumbling of the beds. And finally, after 2 years of dilly-dallying, 61 verses, Jacob arrived at Yitzchak's home. It's been 2 years since he departed from Laban. So Jacob's separation from his father was a total of 22 years, but it was really 2 and 20. It was 2 years traveling, dilly-dallying, and 20 years with Laban. And what's amazing is that our Sages tell us that there's a symmetry, there's a parallel between this 22 years and this 22 years, Jacob's and Joseph's, Jacob's with his father, Joseph with his father. Joseph's 20 years of being away from Jacob are also 2 and 20. Rashi tells us that had Joseph not asked the butler for an assist out of jail, he would have not had those 2 extra years added on. And by the way, the commentaries tell us Or Chaim speaks about this. The Pharaoh was dreaming for 2 years, and every night for 2 years he had that same dream, and then he forgot it. And only after 2 years he remembered it. So had Joseph relied on God exclusively, the entire timeline would have been expedited by 2 years. The 7 years of plenty would have been 2 years earlier. The 2 years of famine would have been 2 years earlier. And he would have met his father. The reunion would have happened 2 years earlier, with Joseph being only 37. So this is a fascinating thing. Jacob, he's told by God to go back to Isaac. And he escapes from Laban. And he navigates the tricky reunion with Esav. And he doesn't go home. Why doesn't he return home immediately? Why does he dilly-dally for 2 years, for 61 verses? So I was actually having a conversation with one of my study partners, and we're talking about this question. And someone else in the Beis Medrash, in the academy, they overheard us talking about this. And he's like, I've been bothered by this question for so many years, for years and years. And then I saw in a book something fascinating. Jacob and all the forefathers, everything that they did had eternal ramifications for their descendants. We're told about Abraham. He traversed the whole land. We read about these descriptions, travel from here. It's like so much details, the itineraries of the forefathers. But the commentaries explain that when they traveled, they were spiritually acquiring and cleansing the land for their descendants. And Jacob spent 18 months in Sukkos. Where was Sukkos? He went to Sukkos and he built a house and he made Sukkos, which means booths or stalls, for his cattle. And he named the city Sukkos. Why does he build a house there? He's traveling, right? Who builds a house while you're traveling? He builds a house. He erects stalls for his sheep. And he does it there in Sukkos. And he names it after the sheep. He doesn't name it after the house. And the Torah tells us all these details. It seems so trivial, inconsequential, and it seems, again, it's crazy for us that Jacob spent so much time along the way after he traverses paths with Esav. So with this book, I don't remember the name of the book, what this book says is that there's going to be another time where Jacob's descendants will build houses for their children and build sukkos, build housing for their sheep in this place. Abraham and Isaac, they conquered, so to speak, they spiritually conquered the land of Israel. But there were other lands that were annexed to the land of Israel, namely the lands that were apportioned to the tribes of Reuven and Gad and half of Manasseh on the Trans-Jordan. So when the forefathers, they traversed all the lands due to be inherited by their descendants, that wasn't just wanderings. That was a means of spiritually acquiring the lands to elevate the lands and make it worthy for their children. But no one had traversed, had lived, had dwelt, had conquered, so to speak, the lands of Gad, the lands inherited from Sichon and Og. And that's what Jacob was doing during those 18 months. He built a house and he built shelters for his flock. You recall, what was the arrangement? Reuven and Gad, they said, well, we're going to go and join our brothers in the war of conquest, but let us first build houses for our children, for our families, and build shelters for our flock. And they're going to go to war, and they're going to leave their families and flocks behind, and they're going to be vulnerable. What Jacob was doing, he was strengthening the spiritual protections of these populations, kind of like the Order of Phoenix did for Harry. That probably makes no sense to 10% of you, to 50% of you. We like to keep our millennial and Gen Z listeners engaged. That's what he was doing. He's naming the place Sukkos. The reason why this land is special because it's grazing land, grazing pasture for the animals. And that's what he was doing for 24 months. He was finishing, so to speak, the patriarchal conquest of the land, which to me is a fascinating idea, a whole deeper behind-the-scenes view of Jacob's travels. That's a novel interpretation as to what Jacob was doing for 24 months. But there's a more basic interpretation that's featured by some of the commentaries on the Torah. Jacob did not approach Isaac rapidly because he was scared. He was frightened of Esav. And therefore he would kind of move and meander and not aggressively approach Isaac. Even though he had successfully navigated that challenge, he did not want to kind of confront Esav again. So he moved a little bit here, a little bit there, and he was edging closer and closer and closer until he arrived. And God told him specifically, go to Isaac. Jacob was scared of Esav. Even though he had overcome that challenge already once before, he had met Esav, he was still scared of him. And that was maybe a bit of a lack of reliance on God. So Jacob has 22 years. It's 2 and 20. It's 20 years with Laban, and then 2 years that really are reflective of a lack of reliance on God. Accordingly, there's even a deeper symmetry between Jacob's 22 and Joseph's 22. Joseph also had, really, it should have been 20 years, but 2 more years were tacked on due to the same attribute, the same insufficient reliance on God. Where did Joseph have this, so to speak, this gap in his character, this insufficient reliance on God? It came from those 2 extra years that Jacob dilly-dallied. The mistake of the 2 was the same. Both Jacob and Joseph, they already had the solution. God already sent the baker, the butler. He sent them the dreams. He sent them the interpretation. Joseph had his problems solved. And there was a little bit, a slight scintilla of lack of reliance on God, which resembles the fact that Jacob also overcame both Esav and Esav's angel, and there was still a little bit of a lack of reliance on God. That attribute, that quality was bequeathed, was perpetuated in Jacob's descendants. Now, this is a very subtle subject, and I'm not really sure where I'm heading with it, because on one hand, we see that Jacob is the paragon of reliance on God. He is not going to go to Egypt to get food unless he has absolutely nothing left. He fulfills the Talmud's description of someone who has total reliance on God, the kind of reliance on God that went extinct with the destruction of the temple. On one hand. On the other hand, we see that he has reliance on God so long as he has Joseph in tow. Once he has the foil, the ability to thwart Esav, well, then he relies on God, which again is a little bit of a different interpretation of reliance on God that we are familiar with. Jacob does not want to approach. He's scared of Esav. Joseph does not rely on God and just allow the butler to do his bidding. On one hand, Jacob embodies this faith. He had a swiftly dwindling stockpile of food and he was unconcerned. Yet we see that he does take concrete action. And this is another reason why this is such a troubling and vast subject. In my grandfather's book, Alei Shur, Volume 2, there's a thick section that relates to bitachon, which I have to admit, I didn't quite finish. I don't know, maybe I've been a rebel about this subject for a while. But it's a broad subject. There's a lot to discuss. It's complicated because there's a Goldilocks zone where we have to take initiative. We have to take action. We do too little. It's negligence. If we do too much, well, that's a lack of faith, a lack of reliance on God. And maybe this is something which everyone needs to find the right place for them. But certainly, and I mentioned this last week, we said Vayeshev stands for V'yiftechu b'cha yodei shemecha. Those who know your name will rely on you. So certainly it's one of the foundational qualities that we all aspire to and we all have to accomplish on some level. But maybe our takeaway is that it's a bit more complicated than you think proceed with caution. It's an idea, something to chew over. If you want to send me some hate mail because you think I got it totally wrong, the email address, rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. Let's get to our dilemma. The weekly dilemma. What to do when you see people going astray? What to do when you see people living lives? They're making mistakes. They're making blunders. They're making poor decisions. To tell them, to not tell them. You have the ability to compel them or not to compel them to improve. My instinct would have been to say, live and let live. That is not what Joseph did. You want food? Circumcise. You don't want to circumcise? Die of starvation. That's the bargain that Joseph gave the Egyptians. Now, just the first question, why circumcision? There's a nice essay in the Maharal who explains that circumcision is a covenant, and covenant connotes continuity, something eternal. And because Joseph saw that their grain did not last, it's spoiled, they're lacking in the attribute of eternality, and therefore he says you have to circumcise. That's why specifically circumcision. But in general, why was he motivated to get them to circumcise? We know we don't proselytize. These are non-Jews. This mitzvah is a Jewish mitzvah. Joseph teaches us a lesson, I think. If you have the ability to influence someone to become more righteous, you have the ability to compel them to be more righteous, if you care about them, you must do it. Joseph is saying, I can give them food and watch them wither spiritually. And therefore, Joseph, I think, is directing us into the proper behavior in this dilemma. If you have the ability to influence someone spiritually, don't say it's not my business. You're giving them bread. You're giving them life. You're giving them vitality. If I'm giving them physical life, all the more so. It's improper for me to withhold from them spiritual life. I think this maybe is something that we have a hard time with. The ethos today is, what people do in their own room, consenting adults, it doesn't bother anyone. None of your business. True. But Joseph is saying, if I'm caring for people, I'm working assiduously to feed them, I'm not just going to feed their body, but allow their soul to wither. I'm going to compel them, if necessary, circumcise, develop a relationship with the Almighty. I thank you for listening. I think this is scheduled to be the last Parsha podcast of 2024, even though we will record, please God, Tuesday night when it's still 2024, but it won't be released until 2025. It's been a great year. I thank you all. With the help of the Almighty, we managed to record a new Parsha podcast every single week in 2024. I want to thank all of y'all, the listeners, the friends, of course, the supporters. Every supporter who supports the great work of the Torch Center in Houston, Texas, is a partner in this incredible season of Parsha podcasts 2024. It's going to be, I think, in 100 years from now, in 1,000 years from now, forever. There's going to be a part of heaven that's dedicated to 2024's Parsha podcast, this incredible study of Torah that we did together here. And all of y'all who are supporters, you have a slice of the action. You got a piece of the action. Grab yourself a piece of heaven. If you still have not yet supported Torch in 2024, you still have a chance. The website is torchweb.org. You find the link in the description of every podcast that we release. Thank you for listening. Thank you for an incredible 2024. Please God, it should be a wonderful 2025, not just for us, our families, our communities, and of course, our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land, especially those who are suffering, who are sick, who, God forbid, the poor people who are hostages, the soldiers on the front line. It should be a great year for all of us. It should be a year of only blessing. And even though it's a secular year, we don't really celebrate it. I think any opportunity that we have for renewal, we embrace. So we're going to start the new year with full of energy. The Ethics Podcast is dropping January 1st. Join this initiative. Let's finish the book of ethics again in 2025. Have a wonderful day, a splendid week, a sensational, terrific, uplifting, fantastic, stupendous Shabbos upcoming. And please God, with the help of the Almighty, we will talk again next week.